So hello everyone, and for any of you who may be watching this later, I'm Lynn Lancaster, the Mellon Humanities Professor at the American Academy. And today we have two of our fellows speaking, Lindsay Sheedy and Kevin Benham. Each will present for about 25 minutes, and we will then take questions for both speakers after they have both finished. And you can either try to raise the hand, either under reactions, evidently, or under participants. So our first speaker will be Lindsay Sheedy, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation Donald and Maria Cox Predoc Rome Prize Fellow in Renaissance and Early Modern Studies. And while at the Academy, Lindsay is working on her dissertation in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Washington University in St. Louis. The dissertation is entitled Un'orrida bellezza, Religious Polychrome Sculpture in the Kingdom of Naples, 1503 to 1714. Today, she will focus on one artist, Vespasiano Genuino, who created a wooden polychrome sculpture of the Bad Thief. And this has been described with the oxymoron, a horrible beauty, hence the title of her dissertation. And these types of wooden and sometimes paper mache polychrome statues are particular to Southern Italy. So she's going to explore this phenomenon in her talk. Lindsay is also the writer, host, and producer of the podcast Stuff About Things, an art history podcast, which currently has 27 episodes dealing with a wide range of subjects from the Bamiyan Buddhas to the Shroud of Turin to Kehinde Wiley's portraits. Each is about an hour long, and I would highly recommend you to check them out. Lindsay is also very engaged in pedagogy, and in 2018 won the Pollard Stein Award for Excellence in Teaching, and then in 2019 the Dean's Award for Teaching. And she's also a senior fellow in the Writing Center at Washington University and has been very active and very helpful in our own internal writers workshop at the American Academy. Our second speaker is Kevin Benham, who is the Prince Charitable Trust and Kate Lancaster Brewster Rome Prize Fellow in Landscape Architecture. Kevin is also the John Emerson Wayne Womack Endowed Professor at the Robert Reich School of Landscape Architecture at Louisiana State University. He started his higher education by double majoring in biology and fine arts at Kalamazoo College. Afterwards, he went on to get a master's in architecture at the University of Michigan, and then finally a master's of landscape architecture at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. And one can sort of read Kevin's intellectual journey here as he ultimately combined his interest in biology and design. Kevin also has extensive teaching experience that runs the gamut from high school students to undergraduates to graduate seminars to developing public outreach programs. His research, though, focuses on landscape phenomena and the temporal qualities inherent in the discipline. He produces installations that elucidate temporal and ephemeral phenomena, which require the viewer to focus over time. And as we'll see in some of the videos he's going to show. He's exhibited his conceptual work at the Chicago Art Department, the Lawrence Arts Center, the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, and internationally, he's had exhibitions in Zurich, Switzerland, at the Royal Institute of British Architects in London, and the Cube Gallery in Manchester, England. And today he will present on line and measure. But first, we will start with Lindsay. So Lindsay can share her screen.
All good? All right. So thank you so much, Lynn. Before starting, I want to echo what Jean said so beautifully last week and thank the Academy for their support in all of its forms, especially the donors who make my Rome Prize possible and the jury members who decided my project merited support, especially when I tell them stories like this one. In the summer of 1895, the Italian writer Gabriele D'Annunzio sailed for Greece on a yacht, as one does. He was to set sail with friends from Gallipoli, a port town located on the southernmost shores of Puglia. D'Annunzio arrived in Gallipoli early and spent the afternoon touring the city. After dark, a local Gallipolini guide arranged for D'Annunzio to visit a local church, which housed the figure that D'Annunzio would later describe as the town's most important citizen. Their destination, the Church of San Francesco di Assisi, sits at the edge of the city where stone meets sea. The guide ushered D'Annunzio into the dark church and then into a chapel on the immediate left. All was in shadow. It was there that the guide lit a candle on the end of a long stick, which he then raised into the air. The shadows parted, bringing D'Annunzio face to face with the figure that would haunt his writings and presumably his dreams for years to come, the one the locals referred to as Il Mal Ladrone, the bad thief. The Bad Thief is a life-size multimedia sculpture that comprises painted and sculpted wooden face, hands, and feet attached to a cloth-stuffed body. Throw in a decaying wig made of oakum and an outfit of questionable taste, and it makes for quite the sight. In true decadent fashion, D'Annunzio at one point described the Bad Thief as un orrida bellezza, a horrid beauty, to describe the push and pull between revulsion and fascination that the Bad Thief inspired. I have since appropriated this phrasing for the jazzy portion of my dissertation's title. Speaking of, in this shop talk, I aim to give you insight into my project, broadly speaking, as well as to invite you into the inner workings of it. So you'll get the big picture, and then we'll descend into chaos. I begin with an overview of the project before summarizing the work that I've done to get us to the point of Vespasiano Genuino. This 20 to 30 page section is what I'm currently working on, and it is to Genuino who the Bad Thief is sometimes attributed, sometimes being the operative word. My dissertation tracks developments in polychrome sculpture in the Kingdom of Naples between 1503 and 1714, when that area of the peninsula was under Spanish control. Here's a sample of some of the works, some of the sculptures on which I work, from large-scale nativity scenes to rather disturbing crucifixions. In my dissertation, I focus on two vital centers of viceregal southern Italy, the capital of Naples and the region of Puglia, both of which were in constant contact with each other, Spain, and the broader Mediterranean world. In Puglia, this was particularly true of the Salento Peninsula, which I've kind of like cordoned off in the dotted red box. It's also known as Italy's Stiletto. It was in these two seemingly polar environments that polychrome sculpture thrived. Additionally, Naples and Puglia both boast a considerable material record of extant sculptures and a fairly decent documentary record as far as southern Italy goes. Although begun in earnest in 1950 with a museum exhibition on wood sculpture of Campania, and all of the photographs of this are of course in black and white, scholarship on polychrome sculpture of southern Italy is still in its nascent stages. The nature of existing scholarship reflects the circumstances of its production, much like the sculptures themselves. This topic is the near exclusive domain of scholars who are regionally anchored in southern Italy, both in terms of where they work and what they work on. Literature on the topic is similarly compartmentalized, existing primarily in the form of edited volumes, conference proceedings, exhibition catalog entries, and journal articles that investigate particular artists, sculptures, genres, and places. To use a metaphor that I quite like, it's like getting handed a map covered in destinations, but with very little by way of navigational direction. My project aims not to fill gaps, but to connect dots. That being said, my dissertation is not a book. It will never be a book. Instead, it has become a blueprint. Each chapter contains enough material for at least one, if not more, perspective books, Each section is a potential essay or lecture. Each footnote is a rabbit hole down which to travel. I have found more than I ever thought possible, and I am extremely lucky to have received the time, support, and opportunity to put it all together in a meaningful way. I do so through a series of connected studies that analyze prominent trends in polychrome sculpture, including what subjects were particularly popular at a given time. What were the dominant patterns of patronage? Were there any technical or material changes? And how did international and interregional exchange inform production? In the scheme of my dissertation, Vespasiano Genuino comes up in a big way in my third chapter, which I'm currently writing. He is an artist best known for producing crucifixions in polychrome wood and sometimes stone, but he also dabbles in other scenes of Christ's torture, like this Christ at the column. His works, just for size reference, tend to be either life-size or about 2/3 life-size. For the remaining time of my talk, I want to take you on a journey, first establishing broad truths about sculptural production of Puglia, before ushering you into my current line of questioning. There are no answers waiting at the end of this material, but I hope they will illuminate my process for working through it. Cue our slow descent into chaos and Puglia. Born in Gallipoli in 1552, Genuino arrived into the world as the political, religious, and artistic tides of Puglia were changing. Despite being part of the Kingdom of Naples since its inception in late 1503, Puglia's relationship with the viceregal capital of Naples and the Crown of Spain only solidified in earnest during the early decades of Genuino's life. In the decades and centuries preceding his birth in 1552, Puglia was far better connected to Venice and Dalmatia than it ever was to Naples. Over the course of the early to mid 1500s, those trade routes began to break down as Venice lost its monopoly over the Adriatic Sea. At the same time, Spain solidified its control over Puglia, whose agricultural industry and many ports made it a particularly special jewel of the Spanish crown. This reorientation of trade routes and political allegiances coincided with the advent of the Counter-Reformation, which catalyzed the spread of new or reformed religious orders and religious doctrine. At this point, the King of Spain had gained the power to elect bishops for almost half of all Pugliese dioceses. And surprise, surprise, his picks for these positions were usually Spaniards. Much like shifting tectonic plates, these moving forces moved against and with each other to change the cultural landscape of Puglia. The final decades of the 16th century, when Genuino would have trained, was also a time of reckoning for Puglia's sculptural tradition. In centuries past, nearly all Pugliese sculptors worked almost exclusively in local limestone, a tradition I examine in my first chapter by focusing on the production of large-scale nativity scenes such as these, which were all of the rage in Puglia from about 1500 to 1570. During this period, whether we're talking about nativities or not, sculpture in marble was practically unheard of in Puglia, and examples in wood and terracotta were also quite rare. You either had monochrome limestone sculpture or polychrome limestone sculpture. Those were the options. In the late 16th century, that begins to change. I established this in my second chapter, which focuses on the production and dissemination of wooden Neapolitan reliquary busts, a sculptural type that had long existed, but that owed a renewed popularity to the advent of the Counter-Reformation. Long story short, the rediscovery of a Roman catacomb in 1578 created a new source of relics for the Catholic world. Naples became a gateway for the dissemination of those relics to Spain and the viceregal provinces, including Puglia. Neapolitan workshops quickly adapted to this sudden demand, both local and international, for relics and therefore reliquaries. What arrived in Naples as bone typically left encased in polychrome busts. There are several large collections of these busts in Puglia, which were sent by Naples-based patrons, including members of the Spanish courts and those of the religious orders, which were working to establish themselves in the province. Pugliese sculptors did try to replicate the effect of these reliquary busts in local limestone, but the material properties of stone stymied them, as mobility was a quintessential quality for Counter-Reformation works. To this day, some of these wooden reliquary busts are still processed through the streets. If you couldn't move the reliquary, you moved the relic, which is why all of these stone busts are empty. They also lack nearly all traces of their original polychrome, the porous limestone having consumed the pigment over time. This marked the first time, at least in the period that I study, that local sculptors had essentially failed to adapt external models to local practices. In smaller centers, whether because wood was unavailable or sculptors simply continued to work as they always had, this inability to adapt led to stylistic stagnation, turning a legacy of stone into a petrified relic. At least one Pugliese sculptor was able to adapt, and of course there were others, but he's the main one, Vespasiano Genuino. Despite knowing more about him than any other sculptor in Puglia during this period, we don't actually know that much about him. There are about 5 or 6 scholars who have really engaged with his life and work. They've concerned themselves primarily with tracing Genuino's life through archival documents, as well as stabilizing a body of securely attributed works. In addition to synthesizing the work that these scholars have done, and of course for the first time in English, I have been working to better understand how Genuino's works were informed by the environment in which he found himself. I have become particularly invested in the way scholars describe Genuino's work as having a Spanish quality or a Spanishness to it. Such language is also used in secondary literature to describe the polychrome sculptures being produced in Naples at this time. This at first seems straightforward, especially when confronted with comparisons like this of Genuino's work and a Spanish contemporary, such as Andalusian sculptor Pablo de Rojas. As of yet, however, there is no evidence of direct contact between the kingdom's sculptors and those of Spain, either directly or through their work. This has left me to grapple with the questions that form the core of my third chapter, and that I hear cater to Genuino. What does it mean for a sculpture in Puglia to look Spanish? And how do we account for that Spanish inflection if there are no proven or even probable points of contact between Genuino and these Iberian sculptors? My first task, of course, is to determine what exactly these scholars mean by Spanish or Spanishness, because they clearly are not referring to a nationality, given that Genuino is Pugliese. I've come to the imperfect conclusion that this term does not necessarily refer to a work's formal qualities, but instead privileges the sense of intense, even violent piety that such sculptures worked to evoke. This is in keeping with Counter-Reformation strictures on images, which sought above all to act as vehicles that moved the soul towards God. These sculptures did that by emphasizing the humanity and bodily sacrifice of Christ. For this reason, crucifixions and scenes of Christ's torture were especially popular at the time. And again, this is another amazing sculpture by Genuino. Now that we've established that, I want to introduce you to the lines of inquiry that I'm currently following as to how this stylistic kinship between Genuino and Spanish sculptors may have developed independent of direct contact. I can't go into all of my working theories, but these are a few of the big ones. The first is that in Puglia, the devotional environment and process of church reform was in Spanish hands. Most men who served as Bishop of Gallipoli during Genuino's life were Spanish, as were many members of local religious orders, some of which, like the Jesuits, have Spanish origins. Genuino worked for at least one of those aforementioned Spanish bishops, a man who was despised amongst locals for his attempts to push church reform onto this coastal diocese. In my chapter, I argue that these Spanish-driven church reforms likely had something to do with the particular blend of piety that is so often perceived as Spanish in Genuino's works, slightly more of an abstract idea. I have taken to describing this as an aestheticization of religious ideology, in a wink to Walter Benjamin, which is about as theoretical as I tend to get. This religious atmosphere was further informed by the books and images that Spaniards and travelers in general brought with them to the city. One such volume was the I never can say this in Latin, Evangelicae Historiae Imagines, which after its publication in 1593 went on to become the early modern equivalent of a bestseller. Written and conceived by a Spanish Jesuit, the book contained 153 prints of Christ's life, produced in collaboration with Flemish and Italian artists. Dozens of copies of this book were circulating in southern Italy by the turn of the 17th century, and it quickly became not just a devotional tool for worship, but an iconographical one for artists. In particular, I see affinities between the anatomical treatment of Genuino's remarkably consistent take on the crucifixion and the print that appears in the Nadal volume. I have also started to wonder, there's a closer up shot. I have also started to wonder if the affinity between Genuino's works and that of Spanish sculptors is partially due to a similar blend of influences from which they were working. I don't love the word influences, but for lack of a better word, we'll say that. After all, Spanish polychrome sculpture did flourish after sculptors like Berruguete brought the lessons of Michelangelo home with them to Spain, where sculptors then adapted them. Such Tuscan Mannerist currents were alive and well in southern Italy, especially in painting and printmaking in the capital of Naples. Along with prints of Michelangelo's works, paintings and prints by his Naples-based acolytes like Marco Pino were also widespread in the provinces, including Puglia. I think it much more likely that Genuino was looking at images like this versus taking a trip to Spain, as some scholars have alleged, because they can't find any other explanation for this kinship. These and other currents would have arrived to Gallipoli by either land or sea. It certainly seems as if Gallipoli was one of the few places that could produce a sculptor like Genuino. In addition to a heavy Spanish presence and the constant exchange of goods and ideas, the port also meant consistent access to certain materials, such as shipments of wood required to produce the barrels for Gallipoli's most precious export, olive oil. Genuino proved adept at handling both local stone and hard woods like olive and walnut, which, in contrast to those empty stone reliquaries, is what ensured that his crucifixions and other life-size works could populate churches throughout the Salentine Peninsula, as well as participate in religious processions. The sheer number of sculptures that he produced also points to a well-oiled workshop that knew its product as well as its patrons. It's no wonder why Genuino's works were particularly popular amongst Reformed Franciscans. He was a tertiary member of the order, and clearly a special one. Upon his death in 1637, he was buried in a Franciscan habit in the Church of San Francesco in his native Gallipoli. As death shepherded Genuino into eternal pasture, the artistic tides of Puglia were once again changing. This brings us back to the mystery of the bad thief. I should say first and foremost that there are still well-respected scholars who believe the bad thief is an autograph work by Vespasiano Genuino. This is in spite of the sculpture being totally inconsistent with the sculptor's style and technique, both of which remained remarkably consistent throughout his long career. These scholars have long pointed to a reference made to the sculpture in 1789, in which it was stated that the bad thief and its companion, the good thief, who never gets talked about, poor thing, are the work of Vespasiano Genuino. As it turns out, however, Vespasiano Genuino had a nephew whose name was Vespasiano Genuino. This nephew was also a sculptor working in Gallipoli in the late 17th century. It was around this time, too, that another force was sweeping the Salentine Peninsula, as the religious orders, especially Reformed Franciscans, began commissioning polychrome works of an increasingly bloody nature. These are best embodied by the works of Calabrian sculptor Angelo da Pietrafita, who in 3 years in Puglia produced a series of macabre crucifixions that, much like the bad thief, might be said to be horrid beauties. Not coincidentally, I talk about these in my 4th chapter. You can also see one of these works at San Francesco a Ripa, which is right down the hill. Ultimately, it really doesn't matter whether or not our, if you will, Vespasiano Genuino made the bad thief, although he probably didn't. The sculptor and this sculpture have become inextricably linked, given that inquiries into Genuino began in large part due to his perceived association with this work. It doesn't hurt that the sculptor is buried in the same church, though no one goes out of their way to visit him. It is instead this sculpture that people seek. It has become nothing less of a local celebrity. This was true in Gabriele D'Annunzio's time, and it's still true today. There's even a book of stories about the bad thief, which I did buy, only to realize that most of them were short stories in which the bad thief starred, rather than a collection of stories based on oral tradition. Either way, it was €15 well spent. I picked up the volume when I first traveled to Gallipoli in 2018. I remember the excitement I felt at being able to retrace D'Annunzio's steps, maybe even those of the Vespasiani Genuini, if you will. As I stood in front of the bad thief looking up, the initial gut punch of repulsion quickly faded into a profound awareness of how this ugly as sin stationary sculpture had brought so much into being and so many people into contact, even if not directly with each other. He is in many ways like a relic, at once a material point of contact with the past, but also an object that beckons, making pilgrims of famous Italian writers and American graduate students alike. I look forward to seeing him again very soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindsay. I wish we could all go see him together, but I'm afraid that might not be possible. Okay, now we'll switch over to Kevin, and Kevin will share his screen. Kevin, we don't have any sound.
Square mile patches of agricultural land forming a quilted
Do you have it now?
stitched together gravel roads and drainage ditches at the perimeter that act as conduits for transportation and hydrology.
Kevin, maybe you could start over so
Yeah,
that
sorry.
we do it from the beginning.
Area, corn, winter wheat, and soybeans. The lines of crops are a study in pragmatism, all planted Let me try that again, sorry.
Okay.
Invisible line. Okay, here we go. Many thanks to the American Academy and to my colleagues for the rich and varied discussions I have had here at the Academy.
I'm not seeing anything now.
Okay, hold on a second. Sorry about that. Many thanks to the American Academy and to my colleagues for the rich and varied discussions I have had here at the Academy. They have been instrumental in framing my talk and have allowed me both time and space to reconsider my past work and begin carving a trajectory for a new body of work. For this, I am very grateful. Line and measure. The Jeffersonian grid has been prominent in forming my views of the landscape and inescapable in the agrarian setting in which I was raised. As a result of the Jeffersonian grid, the land is demarcated into square mile patches of agricultural land, forming a quilt of green stitched together with gravel roads and drainage ditches at the perimeter that act as conduits for transportation and hydrology. This Cartesian grid is further reiterated in the row crops planted in the area: corn, winter wheat, and soybeans. The lines of crops are a study in pragmatism, all planted neatly in rows for the efficiency in seeding, cultivating, and harvesting. Invisible line. In the past few years, my practice has embraced the line and grid as a datum to elucidate temporal, transitory phenomenon and as a catalyst for advantageous ecosystem change. Corn crib Volga. This trajectory was sparked by a move to South Dakota. Corn cribs dot the fields along the highways and remain as a skeletal remnant of an agrarian past that used the elements to dry the harvest. Technology now allows farmers to dry the corn at a much larger scale, so the corn cribs stand as vestigial sentinels of the past. As such, I reinvigorated one of these structures to allow it to become a spectacle and landmark, and to allow the installation to react to the ever-changing weather conditions in the region. To that end, I worked with a local farmer to transform the structure. The resulting installation marks time through observation, response to phenomena, diurnal fluctuations, meteorological conditions, and the seasons. Light line. Corn crib Castlewood. This corn crib in Castlewood, South Dakota is illuminated by a series of LED light strips that are activated by the relative brightness of the atmosphere and powered with solar panels. The installation acts to mark the landscape, elucidate phenomenological conditions, and create a landscape folly from an extant condition. The installation suggests the possibility of inhabitation, the potential for action. It simultaneously registers the relative brightness of the atmosphere. Line is negative. Ice negative. Traditionally, ice fishing occurs on the lakes in South Dakota during the winter months. This installation borrows from that tradition. By creating a large cut in the surface of the lake using an ice saw, an aperture is created that mediates between the water and the sky above. The thickness of the ice is revealed and the dark depths of the water exposed. Atmospheric and climatic conditions during freezing are recorded as a resulting scar on the lake. Temporary line. Time and tide. This piece, installed during a residency at the Edward Albee Foundation at the Barn in Montauk, New York, pays homage to the importance of the sea to the history of Montauk and the surrounding South Fork of Long Island, while also acknowledging the constant flux of the tide. A simple line of sea salt gets engulfed by and is returned to the rising sea. Fabricated lines. Haystack Variants. Haystack Variants consists of a series of intervention using local agrarian structures, i.e. lobster traps, inserted into the architecture and landscape of the campus of Haystack Mountain School of Crafts during an artist residency on Deer Isle, Maine, with generous support of the Wingate Foundation. Using lobster traps sourced from a local fisherman, the series consisted of 20 units that were strategically placed and reconfigured in response to the architecture created by Edward Larrabee Barnes in 1960. During the process of installing a set of the variants, a viscous skin of soap solution was adhered to the structures to develop a surface condition that reacted to the meteorological conditions on the site. The resulting bubbles were carried throughout the site and extended the reach of the intervention. Production line. Hand to mouth. Hand to Mouth sheds light on the poverty in Lawrence, Kansas through a conceptual work that makes tangible the quantity of people living hand to mouth in Lawrence, Kansas. The work, completed during a project-based residency at the Lawrence Art Center, is composed of 19,070 pieces of fired porcelain that were individually formed and bitten by the artist over a 2-week period, and then installed in the center's gallery as a sculptural carpet. Geological line. Strata. Strata is an installation created at Matfield Green, Kansas during an artist residency at the Tallgrass Prairie National Park. The sculpture is created with ground limestone that forms the geological strata in the Flint Hills of Kansas. The stratification of the local geology is mirrored in the piece and coincidentally mimics the layers of vegetation that form the unique ecology of the tallgrass prairie. Inherent in the materiality of the pulverized lime is its susceptibility to wind and draft. The installation clearly exhibits the process of making and the forces acting on the installation process. Line of buoyancy. Float. An ongoing project, Float uses my body as a measure of buoyancy, salinity, as well as a corpus for mediating between water and sky. Floating still with my legs and arms extended for balance, my body becomes a threshold between two bodies of water, that of the sea and the less dense sky above. Line of erasure. Square erased. A performance piece, square erase uses simple geometry and an equally simple action, that of walking, to erase a platonic form and develop a trace of an action. A square of sea salt is first bifurcated and then through an expanded process of walking produces a register of that action. Disruptive lines. Broken kilometer. This collaboration with Arne Fagerriket, the Swedish military, and the County Administrative Board's nature management project Sand Life, which was funded by the European Union, to create the land art project Broken Kilometer. This land work, a kilometer-long cut in the earth and the width of a Swedish tank, is broken into sections, celebrates the tradition of land art while simultaneously fostering increased biodiversity. Increased biodiversity is evident 6 months after the initial installation of Broken Kilometer. Mile-long burn. This companion piece to Broken Kilometer was produced with the cooperation of the National Park Service at the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Strong City, Kansas, and engaged with another form of erasure and disruptive ecology. This collaborative companion piece, Mile Long Burn, capitalized on the use of fire to maintain native species in our dwindling tallgrass prairies. Mile-long burn was enacted in September 2019 after several years of planning and coordination with the National Park Service. The resulting prescribed burn was started as a strict mile-long line along the length of highway that borders the southern end of the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. Quarter drain burn. As an extension of the work in Sweden and Kansas, I have also begun outreach with local sugarcane farmers in Louisiana to develop projects that continue the use of fire to maintain agricultural fields through a series of burns that simultaneously increase the efficacy of yields while maintaining a healthy ecosystem, including increasing habitat for waterfowl. The following images capture the collaborative work quarter drain burn. The quarter drain measure in these field burns is a result of the irrigation that is carefully manipulated through subtle use of topography and the ability to graft onto existing water sources. The resulting quarter drain burn has a linear quality that continues my interest in line and measure in the landscape. One MX, 10 MX, 100X. Erasure by walking after a light snow on a sandy outwash at Massasoit State Park, Massachusetts. 1 meter by 10 meters by 100 times. Line is conduit. Line is cultural tie. My project at the American Academy continues looking at a line in the landscape as framework and generator for potential manipulation and biodiversity. I am particularly interested in the Trattori or drove roads in Belize, and their use in moving herds from the mountains to the valley. These ancient pathways along which animals are moved provide a conduit for the movement of plant species and lead to greater biodiversity along the pathways. I have identified a shepherd in Molise, Mario Barraro, whom I hope to work with and whose family owns land adjacent to the ancient drove roads. He moves his herd of sheep in the meadows along Trituro and produces sheep's milk. He uses horses and Abruzzo sheepdogs to help in herding the animals, and this cooperation between 4 mammal species, sheep, horses, dogs, and man, results in the production of pecorino, a cheese deeply embedded in Italian culture. This page, one of 552 maps from the Capicolato Atlas from the 17th century, housed in the State Archives in Foggia, illustrates the transhuman's route as the center line and datum by which the landscape is understood. Associated buildings are presented as axonometric volumes above and below the center line, and their relative importance is represented by the scale of the illustration. This atlas, drawn by Giuseppe de Falco between 1651 and 1652, shows the width of the track at 60 feet and also illustrates the limit stones, which are reproduced bearing the letters T and R for Trituro Regio. While the maps themselves are fairly simplistic, the notion of the Trituro as the center line suggests the importance of the Trituro as a means of movement through the landscape. Both Lindsay and I have presented projects that support an idea of landscape as conduit for the flow of goods, services, idea, and culture. This suggests a system that binds together cities and countryside as holistic endeavors that exist as a larger system.
Thank you, Kevin. So we'll now open it up for questions for either of the speakers or both speakers. And if you could use, as I said, the raised hand, which you should find under reactions, I think. So I thought just while you guys are thinking of your questions, oh, actually, Kati has a question. Kati, go for it.
I do. Well, thank you both for the talk. It was fascinating. It's really enjoyable to kind of think of the two in relation to one another, but each one on its own was wonderful to hear about. And I was thinking about the framework that Kevin kind of provided in the talk, a kind of taxonomy of lines, right? And which I thought was really very clear and really beautiful. And it made me think a little bit of the last thing that you were talking about, Lindsay, when you were suggesting that there was some blurry line between the polychromatic sculpture, like almost becoming a relic, right? And I was thinking about your podcast, like things about stuff or stuff about things. So there's a kind of taxonomic will maybe in the way that you're thinking about your work as well, or at least one that I'm imposing on it because I'm fascinated by that idea. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about, you know, especially as you're looking at these like very odd and transitional objects, like the distinction between sculpture, relic, object, you know, if you could just flesh that out a little bit more, I'd be interested to hear.
Sure. Okay. So technically, like a relic is usually has an item of a saint or like something that's touched someone. There's like different categories of relics, but it's usually things encased in other things. And according to the Catholic Church, these things in and of themselves do not have power. Like they don't want to make these things into idols, right? Whether or not people actually interacted that way with them, I don't know. I would probably guess not. It's kind of hard to make that distinction of something being a vehicle to something else, but not actually having sort of divinity in and of itself. But to answer your question, what I've found with these sculptures is that over time, like when they were first conceived, it was to move the soul towards God, to get an emotional reaction from the viewer, to aid in devotional practice. But over the centuries, these things have taken on lives of their own, and they become very much beloved by the cities in which they are. Like when I went to Gallipoli, I asked where the Chiesa di San Francesco was, and the guy was like, "Oh, we don't have a church like that." And I was like, "No." And I showed him a picture of the bad thief, and he was like, Chiesa del Maladrone. Like he was like, yeah. So the church is actually now called by locals the Chiesa del Maladrone, which is really interesting. So it's like these objects have become relics of a tradition that these people still feel is alive and well in their communities, and many of them still do serve a devotional function as well. So I think there's a push and pull also between when is something a relic and when is it not, and one object can inhabit both of those roles depending on who's approaching it or where it is.
Alexandra.
Hi, thank you so much, both of you, for this presentation. It was wonderful, and I love the connections of movement and passage that I see in both of your work. I had a question mostly for Kevin, because I noticed that a lot of the works that you showed dealt with sort of ephemeral installations in nature and on shorter timescales. And then this shepherding highway, I don't know what to call it, is something that's been around a lot longer, and probably some of the processes that you're talking about, like increasing biodiversity or escalation of biodiversity along that path, operate differently simply because transmission and passage has happened for so long on the same path. So I'm just wondering, as an artist, how you're approaching this sort of material differently, given the different duration and time scale of your site.
First of all, thanks for that question. What's really interesting about landscape is the way that we experience it, and it is always temporal. And whether that means diurnally, how you experience something during the day or something at night, how you experience it through the seasons, the landscape changes, but also how you experience it through the millennia. And I would actually argue that the tallgrass prairie is, obviously the coincidental with the Trattoria. So the reality is that the tallgrass prairie pits always had these fires throughout time. So even though they're in different continents, and we tend to think of things in the United States as not very old, or that don't have this kind of age to them, but the reality is you can actually look at the prairie and begin to understand these older kind of ideas based on kind of geology, etc. So I think what's interesting for me about the Trattoria is the fact that these sheep, so an animal is actually moving through that landscape and changing the landscape as it's doing it, as is man, and as are the dogs, etc. So for me, what's interesting is how that begins to change over a period of time. And my work can last 5 seconds, or it can last for decades. So the thing for me is that Broken Kilometer will eventually be just this kind of intaglio into the land itself. I think you'll still be able to see it decades from now. It just won't look exactly the same as it did, prior to its installation. So, great question. Thank you.
Benham? You're muted.
I think Elizabeth was before me, if I'm not wrong.
Oh, okay. I wasn't looking at the side. I was just looking at the screen. You want to go, Elizabeth?
Sure, thanks everyone. Well, I just want to comment quickly that I think one of the things Kevin said is another point of interaction, and that is that the experience of the viewer is so important. I think one answer to the first question is relic or sculpture, or it depends on the kind of interaction that the audience has, and that seems to be something that Kevin's really thinking about too. That landscape it's that interaction that's so important. So that seems to be another point of intersection between your papers. But I wanted to ask a question kind of about what motivates you, Kevin, because as and maybe I missed some of the points about the earlier projects, but as you went along, it seemed like the later projects seem more and more kind of engaged in an urgency about the landscape, almost as well, about environmental matters, about protection. I mean, when we think about Broken Kilometer, Mile Long Burn, and your drainage project, they seem to be much more about, and then the most recent about biodiversity, thinking about maybe threats to the landscape or damage to the landscape. And I'm wondering if, as you've come along in your field, that's become more important to you, a sort of preservation or protection or feeling of threat to the environment, or how you place yourself in a sort of environmental politics, I guess.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in this kind of idea about landscape as environment and environmental concerns. I would say that I walked you through kind of the very beginnings of when I started and then kind of moving through that. So I think increasingly I'm interested in kind of biology and the ecological effects of what I do. But I would also say that a lot of the work for me is like a sketch problem. So I often do short little experiments, which then become a project in and of themselves, but then kind of feed onto other projects. So I think there's a kind of trajectory in that body of work that is interesting, and often it's not equivalent, I would say. Like, not all the projects are equivalent in my mind, but they become kind of sketch problems for me to work. And I really don't draw that much. I actually make things one-to-one. So for me, even those simple little projects are kind of, or those time-based projects are really about thinking about the world, thinking about the landscape and how I might begin to engage it.
Okay, now it's Benham's turn.
Thank you both. First of all, I'm happy also to see how things are building upon thing that we heard last week. Even, you know, if we're going back to Jean's talk about surfaces and the theme, all of a sudden now talking about line, we are actually realizing that the word line is not at all what it is, because we are looking at scarce on the surface. We are looking on either additions or abstraction from material. So the whole land become to be a surface, as we learned by Jean about the textile that is not flat and has a relief-like life to its own. So, you know, the whole question of line became to be, is it the right word for dealing with this, what you are doing? Because it's something else that is happening here. But back to also Lindsay, I'm just thinking that if I would think of 3 keywords that bind things together, so traces, I would say traces, because the traces of the divine as part of the relic that keep the traces along the line of connectivity from the divine into the object that is now on display, and the traces that we have in Kevin, but also the whole question of afterlife. That it seems to me that, Lindsay, you are very much interested in the afterlife of this church and of this sculpture, as Kevin is interested in the afterlife of a specific work of art that he did in the landscape, and to see how we change it over time and become something else, disappear or born into something else. The third one is ephemerality, and I wonder if here I can suggest something, because Lindsay, it seems that you don't want, I'm coming now to Lindsay more. It seems that Lindsay is less interested in the notion of let's look for similarity and try to find connectivity, be it between Spain now and Gallipoli in Italy. And I'm just wonder about ephemerality, if we have any evidence, and I'm thinking of what was happening, for example, in Bavaria at that time. I'm thinking of sculpture like Hans Pettel at the beginning of the 17th century, starting also with a very, very strong painted wooden sculptures that, if you look at them, look very much like the ones that you have shown of your artist of the same time. And in Bavaria, it's much more connected to passion theater sculpture that were used in parades made of wood and also colored and you know, dressed for the Passion ephemeral parade. I wonder if you have something like that in the South as well. And I'm thinking if this kind of activity enhance painted sculpture in this region as well.
So those are all great points. Thank you so much for that. I have not looked into Bavaria yet. I will have to do that. But one of, or at least another key difference between what's being produced in Spain at this time and what's being produced in Southern Italy is that I have yet to find any kind of float-like object, because in Southern Italy, they have passos, which are, they could mount on like a foundation that they could then wheel through town. In Southern Italy, it seems to be more that they were focused on being able to process individual sculptures. And we don't have records of those processions until much later, so like late 1700s, 1800s, but they're fascinating because it's like the people who are walking with these works take on those other roles, if you will. But part of me wonders if the reason that they don't really have those passos is because oftentimes what you find in Southern Italy is there's a clear attempt to reference what's happening in Spain, but it's like they don't have the referent with them. So they try to do other things. And the closest thing I can really think of is if the reliquary busts that I showed, those are in something that's called a lipsanoteca, which is a Spanish word. And those are all over Spain. But there's a very clear Pugliese flavor to them, shall we say, that were meant to be temporary until they could build something else. And that just never happened because, you know, Puglia today, Puglia yesterday, Puglia 500 years ago. But we don't have any evidence of sculptures that still exist that were processed until you get to the turn of the 1700s, when you start to get the movable limbs and the cloth bodies, so they're much more easy to process and animate, which is clearly the tradition to which the bad thief belongs. And that's when carta pesta comes up, which made it far easier to process as well. So yeah, that doesn't completely answer your question, but I have thought of it, and perhaps the ephemerality of those things is why we don't have them. You never know, right? Especially given that some of the conditions, like in Gallipoli, the conditions of churches are not great because the air is so salty, it breaks things down so fast. So there's also questions of that, which I thought of when Kevin was talking about like how landscape and weather can provoke these changes over the course of hundreds of years as well.
Maggie.
Yeah, so thank you both for these talks. This is so interesting. So I was thinking sort of, and just tying, Lindsay, you kind of were reading my thoughts at the end, talking about, I've heard ideas so far about sort of transience and this interest in the afterlife that are joining both of your talks. And I wanted to ask you both about kind of the flip side of this transience and ephemerality and how the idea of maintenance and conservation plays into your projects. And sort of how we choose what to maintain, but also how we maintain it. And Lindsay, I have to say the reason I thought of this originally was when you were showing the photo of the Maladrone, and he's wearing clothes, which I presume have to be changed. I mean, they looked very fresh, right? These are not the clothes that he was dressed in, whether it was made in the 16th or the 17th century. So I was just wondering if you could talk, Lindsay, if you know the specific answer to that question about the upkeep of the statue, and then sort of ideas maybe about maintenance in the face of these forces of, weather and nature more broadly in the works that you're studying. And Kevin, if you have anything to add to it, about how you're trying to make us think about what we conserve, or how we, going back to Elizabeth's question about maybe the environmental aspects of your work, I'd be interested to hear that as well.
I'm so excited that you asked that question, because I'm very passionate about the afterlives of these things. Those afterlives often appear as like intros to my chapters or outros to my chapters. Like I try not to focus on them too much because I want to be situating these things art historically, but I have so many stories. But with the bad thief, so it's fascinating because one of the oral traditions that has gone on for at least 100 years is this idea that because he is such a sinful character, that his clothing tends to break down over time and they have to change it all the time, and that he smells really bad and all of these stories. But those can also be explained scientifically because the Chiesa di San Francesco is right on the seashore. And the chapel in which the Maladrona is situated is a later addition to the church. So the walls come into contact with the outside air and whatever else is happening. And they're made of limestone. So it wicks that air into the building. And that's why 10 years ago, the church was completely restored. It looked beautiful. And when I walked in 2018, I was like, what the heck is this? Because it's falling apart. The walls are falling apart again because the moisture gets in and it breaks that down. And if you study, like I've kind of looked into the effect of salt air and salt water on fabrics, and I can guarantee you that that's why those clothes break down. And I want to know, like maybe Therese and I can take a trip to Gallipoli and figure out who makes the clothes for the bad thief. But yeah, it certainly, it extends to the sculpture, those aspects of the environment. And then they get put into legend, which is really interesting. I also wonder about, he's stuffed with cloth, which also makes me wonder what's happening there, because that tends to like compact over time due to the gravity and the moisture, and then he looks crazy. But yeah, certainly you definitely picked up on that, and these sculptures are reacting to those environments to this day, and they still have to be upkept.
Maggie, in response to you, it's a difficult subject simply because we as humans despise change, and we hate entropy, and we try to fight entropy as much as we possibly can, and we fight aging in our society, right? And so all these things are kind of this idea about landscape that is frozen in time, right? And so if you're going to conserve or think about a landscape, you have to think about, exactly what you mean by that. Like, are you going to freeze a landscape in a particular time frame and then continue to put in the effort and energy in order to kind of maintain that in a specific way? So, I mean, personally, I kind of like entropy and the fact that things begin and cycle and then begin again. And so it's a really difficult situation to talk about simply because I think we as humans are so afraid of change and so afraid of difference that we kind of choose to instill that onto our landscapes as well in many ways.
Can I just add something really quick again? I loved what Kevin said about things are not allowed to age, because that's certainly true of polychrome sculpture, especially in Puglia, because in the 1500s, it was primarily made of limestone, which doesn't tend to get moved that easy. And that's why we have a lot more in Puglia than elsewhere that used wood during that time. But over time, these things have been repainted so many times that the act of trying not to let them age is precisely what has sort of ruined them over time. And it's only with restoration work that you really get to like the minuscule amounts of polychrome that still remain after time. And that's been a huge push in Puglia, is this process of restoration for these sculptures, because they're still not going anywhere.
Francesca?
Yeah. Hi, all. And thank you both for the very interesting dissertations. And but in particular, I have a question for Kevin. And first of all, congratulations. I'm really fascinated by your work. And I see in your work such land artists, of course, but I also see something coming from body art. For example, Marina Abramovic's work for the role that the radical ritual has in the revealing the landscape, and conceptual artists as Giovanni Anselmo, for instance, for what concerns the object and its finiteness. But you let work time, eroding by time the space, using the abstract object of the line that you repeat in almost all of your works. And my question concerns the role of the recording video. Could you say more about the recordings? Because it's not just a way to document or archive, I guess.
I mean, I guess when I'm documenting work, obviously I'm figuring out what gets placed in the image and what is excluded from the image, right? So I'm making choices all along. And when I make those choices, I'm trying to decide what it is that I want the viewer to understand. So often those are tightly cropped so that it's very clear about what the idea is. So that's what I would say about documentation, is that I'm making conscious choices about the way that I'm choosing to represent that work. And I think that it's my own bias, quite frankly, right? And that's what I would say about that. That I'm making conscious decisions about what I do include and what I do not include. And I think it's important to do that, because I'm trying to develop kind of a framework that's really understandable, so that the idea is very clear, the conceptual idea is clear.
And the videos are made all by you?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Does anybody else have a question? One last question?
I think that Robert Gerard had one.
Yeah, Robert did have one. He took his hand down.
Yeah, I've been putting my hand up and down sort of tracking what other people are asking.
Yeah.
So it's maybe a little in the weeds, but it was a question for Kevin, and then I was a little self-conscious that I didn't know how to articulate it with Lindsay's presentation either. So again, the hand went down. This is a little too much information, but Kevin, just maybe a quick question, especially since we are now talking about time and media and conservation. In a few of your projects, right, you're using techniques that open the landscape up to processes of secession, vegetal secession, by stripping the landscape of the vegetal cover. You kind of kickstart that process that ecologists are always so interested in, of primary secession followed by secondary secession, ultimately reaching some sort of climax vegetation. And the same is true with the burn pieces, where you're looking at those management strategies that all sorts of different natural services use in order to control the landscape by burning them. But then there's also vegetation that emerges after that, and sometimes that's quite predictable. This is a lot of exposition for the question. I guess what I'm asking is, given that we have some sort of expectation for what vegetation comes back, when you do these projects, how far into the future are you imagining, with a certain degree of expectation, what's going to happen next? And what's the kind of horizon of anticipation beyond which you think there's no way to really predict what one would experience if they came across your piece in the future?
I mean, to be perfectly honest, I have no expectations. I'm simply setting something into motion, and all of these things. So for instance, the project in Sweden with the tanks, those originally tanks ran across the land and actually stirred up the sand, which caused greater biodiversity in that area. Because there's less funding for the military in Sweden, those maneuvers had stopped. But the EU actually had funding for this project, because they were actually going and ripping up land again to kind of expose those sandy soils. So I actually met with the project coordinator and suggested that instead of just ripping up that land, that you could also have this kind of cultural land art piece in addition. So a lot of my work, I figure out a way to tether on to things that are already going to happen, but then I re-describe them or reframe them and work with people in order to reframe that. Because otherwise it would be cost prohibitive for me to actually do the work. And so I try to be clever about the way that I'm kind of working so that that I'm able to do the things I want to do and that they're funded elsewhere, quite frankly. So I'm not ever looking for funding. It's actually already funding that exists. And I'm just figuring out a new way to frame those projects and frame what someone is going to do and convince them to do it, quite frankly. So the National Park Service, for instance, was really interesting to work with because I really had to change the way that they thought about what they were actually doing. And the fact that, I was able to do that with the National Park Service was quite incredible. I'm not sure I answered your question. Maybe I...
Yeah, I mean, there's a back and forth here. It's related and it raises other questions that I'm interested in too, but perhaps it's something for over drinks rather than subjecting everyone to the kind of... Fantastic, both of you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, this is really good. I am continually amazed. Most of these pairings are not really thought out that much. It's just a question of who wanted to go when and your disciplines and things. But it's always fascinating in the end to see what sorts of common themes do come up, because I could not have anticipated what the whole idea of sort of the non-permanence and the change that and as Kevin pointed out, the networking in a sense that you two presented. So thank you once again for two very interesting presentations.